She directed what many historians still call the most effective piece of propaganda ever committed to film. She stood beside Adolf Hitler at the Nuremberg rallies, choreographing the very imagery that would come to define the Third Reich in the popular imagination. She built her Olympic masterpiece with financing quietly funneled through Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, even as she publicly insisted she had no interest in politics at all. And yet, when the war ended and the accounting began, when generals swung from ropes and bureaucrats sat in the dock at Nuremberg, Leni Riefenstahl walked away. No prison sentence, no execution, no meaningful reckoning with the machinery she had helped build. She lived to be 101 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in September 2003, having spent nearly 6 decades insisting, with remarkable consistency, that she had simply been an artist who got unlucky with her choice of subject matter. How does someone who filmed Hitler as a demigod descending through the clouds at Nuremberg, who watched Jewish civilians and Polish hostages be murdered in front of her own camera crew and kept filming anyway, end up dying a celebrated centenarian, feted at film festivals, awarded honours, still defending her legacy on television until practically her final years? This is the story of Leni Riefenstahl, the woman who arguably did more than any other single individual to make Nazism look beautiful, and who never spent a single day in prison for it. To understand how Riefenstahl escaped justice, you first have to understand how she built the myth that protected her, a myth so carefully constructed and so tenaciously defended that it survived Nuremberg, survived 4 separate post-war tribunals, survived decades of investigative journalism, and very nearly survived her altogether. Because Leni Riefenstahl was not merely a filmmaker who happened to work under a dictatorship, she was, by the testimony of colleagues, by her own surviving correspondence, and by the plain evidence of the films themselves, one of the most gifted image makers of the 20th century, and she placed that gift entirely at the service of Adolf Hitler at the precise moment he needed it most. In this video, we will find out exactly how she did it, how she tried to explain it away for the rest of her life, and why, despite everything, the German legal system ultimately let her go. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Helene Bertha Amalie Riefenstahl was born in Berlin on August 22, 1902, the elder of 2 children born to Alfred Riefenstahl, a prosperous heating and ventilation equipment manufacturer, and his wife, Bertha. The family lived comfortably in the wedding district before moving to more affluent quarters as Alfred's business expanded, and from an early age Leni displayed the kind of restless, driving ambition that would define her entire career. Her father wanted her to work in his company, or failing that, to marry well and settle into the conventional life expected of a bourgeois German daughter in the years before the First World War. Leni wanted none of it. What she wanted from childhood was to dance. She began taking gymnastics and ballet lessons in secret without her father's knowledge, and by her teenage years she was studying dance seriously under some of Berlin's most respected instructors, including a period training with the dancer and choreographer credited with popularizing expressive modern dance in Germany. Her mother, who nursed her own thwarted artistic ambitions, quietly supported Leni's defiance of her father's wishes, and the two of them conspired for years to keep Leni's dance training hidden from Alfred. To fully appreciate how unusual Riefenstahl's trajectory was, it helps to understand the specific cultural moment into which she was born and came of age. Weimar-era Berlin, particularly through the 1920s, was one of the most artistically and sexually liberated cities in the world. A place of experimental theatre, cabaret culture, radical new approaches to dance and visual art, and a level of social freedom for women, at least in certain urban educated circles, that would have been unthinkable in the more conservative Wilhelmina Germany of Riefenstahl's early childhood. This was the environment that shaped her artistic sensibility, an environment of restless experimentation and physical self-expression through movement, precisely the milieu that produced the expressive, body-centered dance training she pursued against her father's wishes. It is one of the darker ironies of Riefenstahl's biography that the very artistic freedoms of Weimar Berlin, freedoms the Nazi regime would go on to violently suppress once in power, condemning modernist and expressionist art as degenerate and driving many of Riefenstahl's own former Weimar-era collaborators into exile or worse, were essential to producing the artist who would go on to become that regime's most celebrated filmmaker. Riefenstahl came of professional age in a Germany that celebrated exactly the kind of bold, physically demanding, boundary-pushing art she wanted to make, and when the political winds shifted catastrophically in 1933, she did not retreat from public life or flee into exile as so many of her Weimar-era contemporaries did. She adapted, quickly and with conspicuous success, finding in National Socialism a new patron willing to fund artistic ambitions on a scale the fractious, financially strapped Weimar Republic could never have matched. Her family background also merits closer attention. Riefenstahl's father, Alfred, was a self-made businessman whose heating and ventilation company provided the family with genuine upper-middle-class comfort, and his opposition to his daughter's artistic ambitions reflected a broader generational and class anxiety common among Germany's prosperous bourgeoisie in the years surrounding the First World War, a deep suspicion of the bohemian, financially precarious world of professional performance as an appropriate vocation for a respectable daughter. Riefenstahl's younger brother Heinz followed a more conventional path into the family business and later into military service, and he was killed on the Eastern Front in 1944, one of millions of German soldiers who died in the catastrophic final years of a war that his sister's films had, in no small way, helped make palatable to the German public that sent him and so many others to fight and die in it. Riefenstahl rarely spoke publicly about her brother's death in any detail across the many decades of interviews and autobiographical writing that followed, a silence that some biographers have read as evidence of genuine private grief, too painful to discuss. And others have read as one more instance of Riefenstahl's lifelong instinct to control precisely which parts of her story reached the public and which remained carefully hidden from view. By the early 1920s, Riefenstahl was performing as a solo interpretive dancer across Germany and Central Europe, appearing in Berlin, Prague, Zurich, and Munich, earning enthusiastic reviews for a physically demanding, expressionistic style that drew comparisons to the more famous dancers of the period. She was young, striking, athletic, and utterly determined, qualities that would carry her through the rest of her career, regardless of what obstacles stood in front of her. But her dancing career, which had seemed so promising, came to an abrupt end in 1924 when a knee injury, aggravated by years of punishing physical training, forced her to abandon performance entirely. For most young women, this might have been a devastating, career-ending setback. For Riefenstahl, it was simply a redirection. Sitting in a Berlin cinema, recovering from surgery, she saw a poster advertising a film called Mountain of Destiny, directed by Arnold Fanck, a pioneer of the German mountain film genre that combined dramatic alpine cinematography with romantic, often mystical storylines. She resolved on the spot to become an actress in mountain films, tracked down Fanck in person, and through sheer persistence talked her way into a leading role in his next production, The Holy Mountain, released in 1926. What followed was several years as one of the most recognizable faces in German mountain cinema, starring in a string of Fanck productions including The Great Leap, The White Hell of Piz Palu, and Storm over Mont Blanc, films that required Riefenstahl to perform genuinely dangerous physical feats, climbing real alpine peaks, working in sub-zero temperatures, and enduring conditions that seriously injured several members of the production crews she worked with. It was demanding, occasionally life-threatening work, but it taught her something invaluable that would define the rest of her career: how a camera could be used not merely to record reality, but to mythologize it, to transform ordinary human bodies moving through landscape into something approaching the sublime. She watched Fanck and his cinematographers, most notably the young Hans Schneeberger, use light, altitude, and scale to turn mountaineering into something closer to religious experience, and she absorbed every lesson. Riefenstahl's material circumstances throughout the 1930s reflected the extraordinary level of state patronage she enjoyed. She maintained a spacious villa in the fashionable Berlin district of Dahlem, employed a substantial household and production staff, and travelled with a level of comfort and resource availability that few other German film directors, male or female, could match at the time. All of it underwritten, directly or indirectly, by state and party funds channeled through the production budgets of her Nuremberg and Olympic films. This lifestyle stood in sharp and uncomfortable contrast to the deteriorating circumstances facing Germany's Jewish population and political dissidents during the very same years, a contrast Riefenstahl showed little public awareness of or discomfort with at the time, and one she would later, in her post-war accounts, largely omit from her own retelling of the period, preferring instead to emphasize the artistic pressures and professional obstacles she faced rather than the considerable material privilege those same years afforded her. The mountain film genre itself deserves a moment of explanation, because it was far more than simple adventure cinema, and understanding it helps explain exactly what Riefenstahl absorbed during her years in front of Fank's cameras. Bergfilm, as the genre was known in German, combined documentary-style location photography of genuinely dangerous alpine environments with melodramatic, often mystically inflected narratives about human struggle against nature, purity found through physical suffering, and a kind of romantic nationalism that celebrated the German and Austrian landscape as almost sacred territory. These films were enormously popular in Weimar-era Germany, and critics and historians have long noted, with the considerable benefit of hindsight, how naturally their visual and thematic vocabulary, physical purity, hierarchy, submission to natural and elemental forces greater than the individual would later transfer into Nazi visual propaganda. Riefenstahl did not invent this connection, but she would become, more than any other filmmaker of her generation, the person who most effectively completed the transfer, carrying the aesthetic lessons of the Alps directly into the choreographed mass spectacles of Nuremberg. During the making of The White Hell of Pitzpalu in 1929, in which she starred opposite the mountaineer and filmmaker Gustav Diesel, Riefenstahl endured conditions that seriously tested her physical endurance, including extended periods filming in temperatures well below freezing, sequences shot on genuine glaciers with real crevasse hazards, and a production schedule that pushed cast and crew to genuine physical exhaustion. It was grueling work, but Riefenstahl thrived on precisely this kind of punishing physical challenge throughout her life, a personality trait that would resurface decades later when she took up scuba diving in her 70s and continued diving well into her 90s. Her relationship with cinematographer Hans Schneeberger during this period, both professional and romantic, exposed her directly to the technical side of filmmaking, camera placement, lens selection, the manipulation of light and shadow across snow and ice to create dramatic contrast, knowledge she absorbed hungrily and would put to extraordinarily effective use once she moved behind the camera herself. By 1931, Riefenstahl had grown frustrated with being merely an actress in someone else's vision. She wanted to direct. Using her own savings and money borrowed against future earnings, she founded her own production company, Leni Riefenstahl Production, and set about making The Blue Light, a mystical mountain fable, in which she also starred as a young village outcast named Junta, who possesses a mysterious connection to a glowing grotto high in the Dolomites. Released in 1932, The Blue Light was both a critical and commercial success, and more importantly for Riefenstahl's future, it caught the attention of a rising political figure who was, at that very moment, searching for exactly the kind of visual imagination Riefenstahl possessed: Adolf Hitler. Hitler had seen The Blue Light and was reportedly captivated by it, later telling Riefenstahl herself that he had recognized in her work a rare gift for translating mystical, almost primal imagery onto film, precisely the kind of imagery the Nazi movement wanted associated with its own ideology of blood, soil, and destiny. The Blue Light itself tells the story of Junta, a mysterious young woman living apart from her Dolomite village, who alone can climb the treacherous cliff face leading to a grotto of glowing crystals, visible only when the moon is full, a place the superstitious villagers regard with fear and blame for the deaths of young men who have tried and failed to reach it themselves. A visiting painter befriends Junta and eventually reveals the location of the grotto to the villagers, who strip it of its crystals for profit, an act that indirectly leads to Junta's death as she falls from the cliff, attempting to reach a grotto now stripped of the very mystery that had made it, and her, special. The film's visual style, achieved partly through a specialized film stock and filtering technique that gave its night and mountain sequences an eerie, luminous quality, was widely praised on release and remains, independent of anything that followed in Riefenstahl's career, a genuinely accomplished piece of expressionist mountain cinema. It is worth noting the uncomfortable thematic resonance visible only in retrospect between the blue light story of an outsider destroyed once her mystique is exposed and commodified by the community around her, and the trajectory of Riefenstahl's own career and reputation across the following 70 years, though there is no evidence Riefenstahl herself ever drew or intended any such parallel. Critics at the time of the Blue Light's 1932 release, including some who would later flee Germany as the Nazi persecution of Jewish and left-leaning cultural figures intensified, praised the film's visual poetry while remaining largely unaware of the dark historical irony that its lead actress and director would, within a matter of months, become the preferred filmmaker of the very regime that would soon drive many of those same critics into exile. Their first meeting took place in May 1932, arranged after Riefenstahl wrote to Hitler requesting an audience, and by her own later account she was immediately struck by what she described as his magnetic, hypnotic presence, though she would spend the rest of her life insisting this fascination was purely aesthetic and never political. Whatever the precise nature of her attraction, the professional relationship that followed would define the rest of the decade. In 1933, shortly after the Nazi seizure of power, Riefenstahl was commissioned to direct a documentary of that year's Nuremberg rally, resulting in a short film called Victory of Faith. It was a rushed, technically flawed production, made in a matter of days with limited resources, and Riefenstahl herself was reportedly embarrassed by its quality. The film has an additional layer of historical awkwardness attached to it. It prominently features Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, who would be murdered on Hitler's orders barely a year later during the Night of the Long Knives. After Röhm's fall, the Nazi regime moved to suppress Victory of Faith almost entirely, and for decades only a single surviving print, held in a private collection in England, kept the film from vanishing completely. Whatever the shortcomings of Victory of Faith, Hitler was sufficiently impressed with Riefenstahl's raw talent and sufficiently invested in the propaganda potential of documentary filmmaking that he commissioned her again for the following year's Nuremberg rally. What resulted was Triumph of the Will, released in 1935, and it would become the single work most responsible for cementing Riefenstahl's historical reputation, for better and overwhelmingly for worse. The scale of the production was staggering by any standard, let alone for a documentary. Riefenstahl commanded a crew of over 170 people, including 36 cameramen operating from specially constructed elevated platforms, moving cameras mounted on rails, cameras attached to flagpoles rising above the crowds, even aerial shots taken from an airplane, all coordinated to capture the September 1934 Nuremberg rally as a piece of quasi-religious theatre. Every element of the actual rally itself, the marching formations, the torch-lit processions, the choreography of tens of thousands of party members moving in unison, had in fact been designed in close consultation with Riefenstahl and the party's own architects and stage managers, meaning the event was essentially built from the outset to be filmed. This was not documentary in any conventional sense. It was, as Riefenstahl herself understood perfectly well, propaganda constructed as spectacle, with the rally itself serving as a stage set for the camera rather than the other way around. The film opens with Hitler's plane descending through clouds toward Nuremberg, an image so deliberately evocative of divine arrival that its propagandistic intent could not be clearer. Shadows of the aircraft rippling across marching columns of soldiers below like a portent from the heavens. Riefenstahl employed techniques that were genuinely innovative for 1935. Tracking shots that glided alongside massed formations, low-angle photography that made ordinary Nazi functionaries appear monumental and heroic, editing rhythms synchronized to martial music that built a hypnotic, almost trance-like emotional momentum across the film's nearly 2-hour runtime. Whatever else can be said about Triumph of the Will, and there is a great deal that must be said about it, it remains one of the most technically accomplished pieces of filmmaking of its era, which is precisely what has made it such an uncomfortable object of study ever since. Film schools around the world still teach its editing and camera techniques, even as they teach it alongside sober warnings about the uses to which cinematic genius can be put. It is worth noting that Triumph of the Will was not, in fact, Riefenstahl's final Nuremberg production. Stung by complaints from the Wehrmacht High Command that the army had been underrepresented in the 1935 film, largely because military leaders had been wary of associating too closely with the Nazi party apparatus at the time of filming, Riefenstahl returned to Nuremberg in 1935 to direct a short follow-up film, Tag der Freiheit, or Day of Freedom, focused specifically on displays of German military hardware and discipline. The short film served, among other things, as a piece of quiet propaganda for German rearmament at a moment when Germany was openly violating the disarmament provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, presenting tanks, artillery, and marching soldiers in the same monumentalizing visual language Riefenstahl had already perfected. A reminder that her collaboration with the regime's propaganda apparatus was not confined to the two features for which she is best remembered, but extended into smaller, more narrowly targeted commissions whenever the party's needs required them. The content of Triumph of the Will itself repays closer examination, because its specific sequences reveal just how deliberately the film was constructed to serve immediate, concrete political purposes, rather than simply documenting an event that would have unfolded identically without a camera present. The film includes an extended sequence depicting reconciliation between the army and the SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, whose leadership, including Ernst Röhm, had been murdered by Hitler's own SS just months before the rally took place during the Night of the Long Knives. Riefenstahl's camera lingers on scenes of SA members marching in apparent unity with Wehrmacht soldiers and Hitler addressing assembled SA formations with language explicitly designed to draw a line under the recent internal purge and project an image of restored party unity to a German public that had been unsettled by the violence of Röhm's killing. This sequence in particular demonstrates that Triumph of the Will functioned not merely as generalized mood-setting propaganda, but as a specific, timely political intervention, addressing a specific and recent crisis within the regime's own leadership, which makes Riefenstahl's later claims of political naivety and simple documentary intent especially difficult to sustain under any serious scrutiny. The choreography of the rally itself deserves particular attention, since it illustrates the extraordinary degree of coordination between Riefenstahl's filmmaking needs and the party's own event planning. Hitler Youth formations, labor service brigades, and party political leaders rehearsed their marching patterns and formations in advance, with explicit consideration for how the resulting movement would read on camera, wide symmetrical blocks of uniformed bodies designed to fill the frame with an overwhelming sense of scale and unity when viewed from Riefenstahl's elevated platforms. Speeches were timed and staged with camera placement in mind, and even the lighting of the evening torchlight processions was coordinated to produce the most dramatic possible visual effect once captured on film stock. This degree of coordination is precisely why historians reject the notion, still occasionally advanced by Riefenstahl's dwindling number of defenders, that Triumph of the Will was simply documentary footage of an event that would have looked identical without her involvement. The event and the film were, from the earliest planning stages, conceived as a single integrated production, with the physical rally serving the needs of the camera as much as the camera served to record the rally, a genuinely novel and disturbing fusion of political spectacle and cinematic propaganda that had few, if any, precedents anywhere in the world at the time. For her efforts on Triumph of the Will, Riefenstahl received the National Film Prize, including recognition at the Venice Film Festival, where the film won a gold medal. But what would this acclaim cost her when the war ended and the world finally reckoned with what Triumph of the Will had actually been built to accomplish? That question would not be answered for another decade, and by the time it was, Riefenstahl had already built her defense, one she would maintain with unwavering consistency for the rest of her extraordinarily long life, that she had merely been a documentarian recording an event that already existed, an artist who happened to be present, not an architect of the propaganda itself. It was, as post-war investigators and historians would eventually demonstrate in exhaustive detail, a claim that did not survive close contact with the evidence. Riefenstahl's next major project would take her international reputation to even greater heights, and it remains, alongside Triumph of the Will, the work by which she is most remembered. When Berlin was awarded the 1936 Summer Olympics, the Nazi regime saw an unparalleled opportunity to present a sanitized, modernized image of Germany to a watching world, one that would obscure the regime's persecution of Jews, political dissidents, and other targeted groups behind a veneer of athletic achievement and national pride. Riefenstahl was commissioned to direct the official documentary of the Games, and the resulting two-part film, Olympia, released in 1938, would prove even more technically ambitious than her Nuremberg work. She deployed camera operators in pits dug into the track itself to capture runners from ground level, mounted cameras on rails that travelled alongside swimmers, used slow-motion photography to transform diving competitions into balletic, almost abstract studies of the human body in motion, and shot at angles no sports documentary had previously attempted. The film's aestheticized celebration of physical perfection, muscular bodies gleaming with sweat, javelins arcing against clear skies, divers frozen mid-rotation against clouds, drew heavily on a visual vocabulary of idealized human form that dovetailed disturbingly well with Nazi ideology's own obsession with physical perfection and racial hierarchy, even as the film also, notably, included substantial and celebratory footage of Jesse Owens, the black American sprinter whose 4 gold medals directly contradicted the regime's racial pseudoscience. It is important to understand the broader political stage management surrounding the 1936 Games that Olympia was designed to capture and celebrate. In the months leading up to the Olympics, the Nazi regime, anxious to avoid an international boycott and eager to present its most palatable face to visiting foreign athletes, journalists and dignitaries, temporarily ordered the removal of anti-Semitic signage from Berlin's streets, softened some of the public rhetoric of its persecution campaign, and generally staged an elaborate temporary performance of moderation for the benefit of the watching world. Once the Games concluded and the foreign visitors departed, this performance ended almost immediately, and the regime's persecution of Jews and other targeted groups resumed and indeed intensified in the years that followed, culminating within just over 2 years in the violence of Kristallnacht that Riefenstahl herself would witness the immediate aftermath of during her ill-fated American trip. Olympia, in this sense, was not merely a celebration of athletic achievement, but the visual capstone of an elaborate propaganda operation designed to reassure the world at the exact moment such reassurance was most valuable to the regime, that Nazi Germany was a modern, orderly, and fundamentally unthreatening nation, an impression Riefenstahl's camera helped cement in the minds of millions of viewers around the world who had no way of knowing how thoroughly stage-managed the entire spectacle, streets and all, had actually been. That inclusion of Owens has been cited by some of Riefenstahl's later defenders as evidence that Olympia was not, at its core, a racist or straightforwardly propagandistic work, but historians have generally rejected this framing as far too generous. The film was financed substantially through the Nazi propaganda ministry, despite Riefenstahl's later insistence that it had been an independent production and its entire purpose, understood clearly by everyone involved at the time, was to present the 1936 Games and, by extension, the Third Reich itself as a triumph of order, vitality, and national renewal to audiences both domestic and international. Olympia would go on to win the top prize at the Venice Film Festival and receive praise from critics and filmmakers around the world, including admirers in Hollywood, who, in the years immediately before the war, had not yet fully grasped or chosen to fully grasp what the regime that had financed the film was actually doing to its own citizens. Riefenstahl travelled to the United States in late 1938 to promote the film, a trip that coincided almost exactly with Kristallnacht, the November pogrom during which Nazi mobs destroyed synagogues and Jewish-owned businesses across Germany and murdered dozens of Jewish civilians. American reaction to her presence soured immediately and dramatically. Screenings were cancelled, prominent Hollywood figures refused to meet with her, and Riefenstahl returned to Germany, having learned, if she learned anything at all from the experience, that the outside world was beginning to see through the elegant surface of the propaganda she had helped construct. The technical innovations Riefenstahl brought to Olympia extended well beyond the camera pits and slow-motion diving sequences already mentioned. She commissioned custom-built equipment for the production, including specially designed underwater camera housings that allowed her cinematographers to film swimming events from below the water's surface, a technique virtually unprecedented in sports documentary at the time. And she experimented extensively with telephoto lenses to capture tight, intimate shots of athletes' faces and muscles, straining at moments of peak physical exertion, images that transformed individual competitors into something closer to classical sculpture come to life. Editing the massive volume of footage generated by dozens of cameras across 16 days of competition took Riefenstahl and her editing team nearly 2 full years, an extraordinarily long post-production period that reflected both the sheer scale of the material and Riefenstahl's own famously exacting perfectionist approach to structuring rhythm and pacing, an approach colleagues described as verging on obsessive, with Riefenstahl reportedly reviewing individual frames repeatedly to achieve precisely the visual and emotional effect she wanted from a given sequence. It is worth dwelling further on that November 1938 American trip, because it offers one of the clearest windows into how Riefenstahl's international reputation was already beginning to fracture even before the war started. She arrived in New York expecting to be received as the celebrated artist she had been in Europe, with meetings arranged with major studio figures and screenings planned to promote Olympia to American distributors. Instead, news of Kristallnacht broke within days of her arrival, and the American public and press reacted with horror to reports of synagogues burning and Jewish citizens being beaten and murdered in the streets of German cities. Riefenstahl's own account, offered decades later, claimed she had been shocked and disbelieving when she first heard the reports, and that she had even sent a telegram to Hitler expressing her concern, a claim that, like so many of her post-war assertions, cannot be independently verified and that many historians regard with considerable skepticism given her documented pattern of retrospective self-exculpation. Whatever her private reaction, her public conduct during the remainder of the trip showed no meaningful break with the regime she represented. Major studios declined to meet with her. Prominent figures in the Jewish-led film industry organized boycotts of her presence, and only a handful of contacts, including the aviator Henry Ford, whose own anti-Semitic sympathies were well documented, remained willing to receive her publicly. She returned to Germany having failed almost entirely in her commercial objectives for the trip, but having learned, or perhaps confirmed what she already suspected, that the regime she served was beginning to generate the kind of international revulsion that no amount of cinematic brilliance could fully paper over. By the time she returned home in early 1939, Riefenstahl was arguably the most famous female filmmaker on Earth, celebrated by the regime, decorated with honors and personally close to the highest levels of the Nazi leadership. She had built, through genuine and considerable artistic talent, one of the most effective propaganda operations of the 20th century. But the war that would break out later that same year would draw her into direct, undeniable, and far darker complicity with the machinery of Nazi violence, complicity that would go well beyond the studio and the editing room and place her, quite literally, on the ground as atrocities unfolded in front of her own camera. That is where our story turns next. Before we cross into the war years, it is worth pausing on something that made Riefenstahl unusual, even within the highest circles of the Nazi propaganda apparatus: her uneasy, often openly hostile relationship with Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, who technically oversaw all German filmmaking. One might assume that the woman who directed the two most celebrated propaganda films of the era would have been Goebbels' closest collaborator. But the surviving record, including entries from Goebbels' own diaries, tells a very different story. Goebbels resented Riefenstahl's direct access to Hitler, which bypassed his ministry's usual chain of command, and he viewed her as vain, difficult, and manipulative, complaints that appear again and again in his private writings across the 1930s. Riefenstahl, for her part, later claimed that Goebbels had repeatedly obstructed her work, withheld resources, and even made unwanted advances toward her, allegations she maintained for decades after the war, as part of a broader narrative in which she positioned herself as someone who had operated in spite of the Nazi propaganda ministry, rather than through it. Historians have generally treated this claim with considerable skepticism, since the financial and logistical support Riefenstahl received for both Triumph of the Will and Olympia flowed, whatever the internal politics, from state coffers that Goebbels' ministry ultimately controlled. What the friction with Goebbels does reveal, however, is the peculiar nature of Riefenstahl's position within the regime. She was neither a party bureaucrat nor a mere hired director, but something closer to Hitler's personal favourite, an artist granted extraordinary latitude and resources because the Führer himself valued what she produced above the objections of even his own inner circle. This personal relationship with Hitler is worth dwelling on for a moment because it would become the single most consequential fact of Riefenstahl's post-war life, the fact her defense attorneys would spend years trying to minimize and that her critics would spend decades insisting could never be minimized. The two were seen together frequently throughout the mid-1930s, at party functions, at private screenings, at the Berghof, Hitler's alpine retreat, where Riefenstahl was a repeat guest. Rumours of a romantic relationship circulated at the time and have persisted ever since. though no conclusive evidence has ever surfaced to confirm anything beyond a close professional and personal friendship. What is not in dispute, because Riefenstahl herself never seriously disputed it, is that she enjoyed a level of trust and access from Hitler that few other Germans, male or female, party member or not, ever approached. When she needed equipment, she got it. When she needed personnel pulled from other assignments, she got them. When Nuremberg rally organizers objected to her camera, platforms disrupting their carefully planned formations, Hitler personally overruled them. This was not the position of an apolitical artist merely documenting events that would have happened with or without her. This was the position of someone operating with the direct patronage of the head of state, a patronage she actively sought, cultivated, and benefited from for the better part of a decade. It is also worth noting, before the war fully arrives in our story, how Riefenstahl handled the deteriorating situation for Jewish colleagues and friends in the years immediately preceding the conflict, because her own conduct here would later become a significant point of post-war controversy. Riefenstahl had worked with and maintained friendships with several Jewish film professionals earlier in her career, including her longtime cutter and close collaborator Béla Balázs, a Hungarian Jewish writer and film theorist who had co-written the screenplay for The Blue Light and mentored her extensively in the craft of filmmaking during her transition from actress to director. As the Nazi regime's anti-Semitic laws tightened through the mid-1930s, Riefenstahl's public association with Balázs became a liability, and in a pattern that would repeat throughout her career, she moved to distance herself from his contribution to her early success, at one point attempting to have his name removed from the credits of The Blue Light entirely, a fact that surfaced during post-war litigation and did considerable damage to her claims of having been merely an apolitical artist untouched by the regime's racial ideology. Balázs himself would survive the war, having fled to the Soviet Union, but the episode illustrates a pattern of behavior, prioritizing her own career and reputation over loyalty to colleagues whose safety was increasingly at risk, that would recur in far more serious form once the war began. The final months before the German invasion of Poland found Riefenstahl at the height of her creative and political capital, already planning her next major project, a film adaptation of the opera Tiefland, which she intended to direct and star in herself. She could not have known in the summer of 1939 just how directly and how personally the coming war would implicate her in crimes that no amount of post-war reinvention would ever fully allow her to escape, even if the German legal system ultimately declined to punish her for them. The production of Tiefland, delayed repeatedly by the war and completed only years later under circumstances involving forced labour from a Nazi concentration camp, would become perhaps the single most damning piece of evidence against her, more damning in some ways than either of her two most famous propaganda films, because it involved not the abstraction of political imagery, but the direct exploitation of human beings imprisoned by the regime she served. That story, along with her presence as an eyewitness to a Wehrmacht massacre of Polish and Jewish civilians in September 1939, forms the darkest chapter of her wartime record, and it is where we turn next, because it is this chapter, more than any other, that later prosecutors, journalists and historians would use to try to hold her accountable, and that Riefenstahl herself would spend the rest of her exceptionally long life trying to explain, minimize, and ultimately deny. There is one more dimension of Riefenstahl's pre-war career worth understanding before we move forward, because it speaks directly to the central puzzle of her entire life story. How a woman who was, by nearly universal agreement among film historians, one of the most technically gifted directors of her generation, chose again and again to place that gift in service of an increasingly murderous regime, and then spent the rest of her life insisting the choice had never really been a choice at all. Colleagues who worked alongside her during the making of Triumph of the Will and Olympia consistently described someone who was exacting to the point of tyranny, capable of reducing crew members to tears over minor technical imperfections and utterly consumed by the pursuit of a specific aesthetic vision, sweeping, monumental, physically idealized, that happened to align almost perfectly with the visual language the Nazi regime wanted for itself. Was this alignment a coincidence, the natural convergence of an artist's personal taste with a political movement that happened to share it? Or was it something close to collaboration, an artist consciously bending her considerable talents toward the service of an ideology she found, at minimum, aesthetically and professionally useful. Riefenstahl's own post-war answer never wavered. She had been apolitical, interested only in beauty and form, and the fact that Hitler's regime happened to provide the resources and the subject matter for her greatest works was, in her telling, simply an accident of history that she had the misfortune to be caught up in. Few serious historians who have examined the full record, including her own extensive private correspondence with party officials requesting funding, equipment, and personnel, have found this defense persuasive. The evidence suggests instead a filmmaker who understood exactly what she was doing, who actively sought out and cultivated the patronage of a genocidal regime, because that regime offered her resources, prestige, and creative freedom that no other patron on earth could match at that particular moment in history, and who continued to seek that patronage for years after the persecution of Jews, political prisoners, and other targeted groups had become impossible for anyone paying attention to ignore. This is not to say Riefenstahl's technical achievements were fraudulent or that the innovations she brought to documentary filmmaking were somehow less real because of the purposes they served. The tracking shots, the aerial photography, the underwater and slow-motion techniques pioneered during Olympia, the sheer scale and ambition of the Nuremberg rally footage, all of it represented genuine advances in cinematic technique that influenced filmmakers for generations afterward. Filmmakers who often had no interest whatsoever in the political content of the works themselves and simply wanted to study how the images were constructed. This is precisely what makes Riefenstahl such a uniquely uncomfortable figure in film history. More uncomfortable in some ways than propagandists whose work was crude or forgettable. Her films were not crude. They were brilliant, and their brilliance is inseparable from their function, which was to make totalitarian violence look beautiful, orderly and inevitable to millions of ordinary Germans and to a watching world that had not yet fully reckoned with what National Socialism actually intended to do. As war approached in the late summer of 1939, Riefenstahl had already secured her place as the regime's preeminent visual artist. What she had not yet done, and what would happen within days of the German invasion of Poland, was witness firsthand the violence her propaganda had helped make possible, standing close enough to see it with her own eyes, filming it with her own camera crew, in a small Polish town whose name would follow her, in whispers and accusations, for the rest of her very long life. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Leni Riefenstahl did something that few other German civilians, let alone Germany's most celebrated female filmmaker, would have done. She volunteered to accompany the invading Wehrmacht as a war correspondent, forming her own small film unit and following combat troops directly into occupied Polish territory. This was not a passive documentary assignment carried out from a safe distance. Riefenstahl, dressed in a specially tailored military-style uniform, travelled with frontline units, and within days of the invasion beginning, she found herself in the small town of Konski, where on September 12, 1939, she became an eyewitness to one of the earliest documented Wehrmacht atrocities of the entire war. The events at Konski unfolded after German soldiers, tasked with forcing local Polish civilians, including a significant number of Jewish residents, to dig graves for German soldiers killed in nearby fighting, opened fire on the assembled civilians, killing more than 20 people in a matter of minutes. Some accounts suggest the toll was considerably higher. Riefenstahl was present with her camera crew at the moment the shooting began. Surviving photographs taken by other photographers present at the scene rather than by Riefenstahl's own crew show her in visible distress, her hand raised as if in protest or shock, her expression captured in what would become one of the most scrutinized images of her entire career. For decades afterward, this photograph would be presented by Riefenstahl's defenders as proof of her horror at what she had witnessed, evidence that she was a bystander, sickened by violence she had no part in and no power to stop. Her critics, and the post-war investigators who examined the incident in detail, painted a considerably less flattering picture. What is not disputed is that Riefenstahl was present, that she witnessed the killing of Polish and Jewish civilians at close range, and that she continued her work as an embedded correspondent with the Wehrmacht in the days and weeks that followed. What is disputed, and what became a central point of contention in the post-war tribunals that would eventually examine her conduct, is precisely what she did in the immediate aftermath. Riefenstahl's own account, offered repeatedly over the following decades and with only minor variations, held that she had been horrified by the killings, that she had confronted a German general about the massacre, and that she had left the front lines shortly afterward, disgusted by what she had seen and wanting no further part in the violence of the war. Witnesses who were present, along with subsequent historical investigation, painted a more complicated picture, one in which Riefenstahl's departure from the front had as much to do with logistical friction and professional frustration over the conditions of her assignment as with any moral crisis triggered by the massacre itself. What can be said with confidence is that Riefenstahl did not use whatever influence she possessed, and by September 1939 she possessed a great deal of it given her personal relationship with Hitler, to raise any public objection to what she had witnessed, did not attempt to have those responsible held accountable, and did not speak publicly about the massacre again for years until post-war investigators forced the subject into the open. The photograph of Riefenstahl's apparent distress at Konski has itself become a small but revealing case study in how historical images can be mobilized to support entirely opposite interpretations of the same event. Riefenstahl's defenders have pointed to it for decades as visual proof of her innocence and horror, a single frozen instant that supposedly captures the true humane reaction of a woman confronted unexpectedly with atrocity. Critics have countered that a photograph of momentary shock proves nothing about a person's broader complicity or subsequent choices, noting that plenty of perpetrators and bystanders throughout history have displayed genuine, even visible distress at violence in the moment while nonetheless continuing to serve, benefit from, and enable the systems that produced it. The debate over this single image, endlessly reproduced in books, documentaries, and articles about Riefenstahl's life, illustrates something important about how the visual record of the Nazi period continues to be contested and reinterpreted even now, more than 8 decades after the events themselves. And it is a fitting irony that a woman who built her entire career on the manipulative power of the image would herself become defined, in the historical memory of her critics and defenders alike, by the ambiguous meaning of a single photograph she didn't even take. Was Konski a moment of genuine moral horror for Riefenstahl, a sudden and unwelcome collision between her carefully cultivated apolitical self-image and the actual violence her regime was capable of? Or was it simply an inconvenience, an unpleasant episode she wished to distance herself from professionally and personally, without any deeper reckoning with what it revealed about the nature of the war she had chosen to document? The honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty what was happening inside Riefenstahl's mind in September 1939. What we can know, because the documentary record makes it clear, is what she did afterward, and what she did was return to her filmmaking career, continue accepting resources and patronage from the same regime whose soldiers she had watched murder civilians, and begin work on a new and deeply troubling project that would occupy much of the remainder of her wartime years, the film adaptation of the opera Tiefland. Tiefland, a story of love and betrayal set in the Pyrenees, had been a passion project for Riefenstahl for years before the war, and production finally began in earnest in the early 1940s, with Riefenstahl directing and starring as the lead character, a Spanish dancer named Marta. The production was plagued by delays, illness, including a serious health crisis that hospitalized Riefenstahl for extended periods, and the general chaos of wartime Germany, and it would not be completed until 1944, with its premiere delayed all the way until 1954, nearly a decade after the war's end. But it is not the plot or the production troubles of Tiefland that matter most to Riefenstahl's historical legacy. It is the identity of many of the film's background extras, the villagers and townspeople who populate its Spanish setting, because a substantial number of them were Roma and Sinti prisoners taken directly from Nazi internment and concentration camps, specifically from the Maxglan camp near Salzburg and the Marzahn camp near Berlin, and put to work as unpaid, coerced labour on Riefenstahl's film set. This fact, buried for decades and only fully substantiated through painstaking post-war and later historical research, would become perhaps the single most damaging piece of evidence against Riefenstahl's lifelong insistence that she had been an apolitical artist, untouched by the regime's crimes. These were not paid extras who happened to be Roma. They were prisoners, held against their will in camps established specifically to persecute and eventually exterminate Roma and Sinti populations as part of the broader machinery of Nazi genocide, transported under guard to Riefenstahl's film set, made to work without meaningful compensation, and then returned to the camps once filming concluded. Riefenstahl maintained until the end of her life that she had personally selected the extras, paid them fairly, and had no knowledge of what subsequently happened to them. Statements that survivors and their descendants, along with the historians who eventually tracked down camp records and survivor testimony, would flatly and repeatedly contradict. A significant number of the Roma and Sinti extras who worked on Tiefland were later deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where many were murdered. When confronted with this fact decades later, in the final years of her life, Riefenstahl continued to insist she had seen every one of the extras alive after the war, a claim that was demonstrably false and that she was eventually forced to retract, at least partially, after a successful defamation lawsuit was brought against her by a survivor who was very much alive and very willing to testify to the truth of what had happened. The massacre at Konski did not occur in isolation. It was one of hundreds of similar atrocities committed by German forces during the 6-week campaign that conquered Poland in September and October 1939. Part of a broader, deliberately brutal occupation policy that would see tens of thousands of Polish civilians, intellectuals, clergy and Jews killed in the war's opening weeks alone, well before the more systematic machinery of the Holocaust had even been established. Wehrmacht units operating alongside specialized SS and police formations carried out summary executions, reprisal killings, and the beginnings of a broader campaign of terror intended to decapitate Polish society and pave the way for its subjugation, a campaign that historians now recognize as an early foundational chapter of the genocidal violence that would engulf the region for the remainder of the war. Riefenstahl's presence at Konski places her, however briefly and however much she would later minimize her proximity to it, within direct eyewitness range of this opening chapter of Nazi mass violence, at a moment when the war's ultimate trajectory toward the Holocaust was still technically in its infancy, but when the fundamental willingness of German forces to murder civilians in large numbers had already been unmistakably established for anyone paying attention, and Riefenstahl, standing there with her camera crew, was about as close to paying attention as any German civilian would ever be. This episode, more than Triumph of the Will, more than Olympia, and arguably even more than her presence at Konski, represents the clearest and most direct evidence of Riefenstahl's willing complicity in the crimes of the Nazi regime, because it did not require any interpretation of artistic intent or propagandistic effect. It involved the literal physical exploitation of people imprisoned specifically because of their ethnicity, people who were then sent to their deaths on a film set that Riefenstahl personally directed and controlled. And yet, remarkably, this would not be the basis on which post-war German courts ultimately evaluated her conduct, a fact that says a great deal about the limitations and priorities of Germany's early denazification process, which we will examine in detail shortly. The person most responsible for finally forcing this evidence into the open was Nina Gladitz, a German documentary filmmaker who spent years during the late 1970s and early 1980s tracking down surviving Roma and Sinti witnesses and painstakingly reconstructing the production history of Tiefland from camp records, contemporaneous correspondence, and survivor testimony. Gladitz's 1982 documentary on the subject presented direct testimony from surviving extras and their relatives describing the coercive conditions under which they had been brought to the film set and the fate that awaited many of them afterward, and it triggered a bitter, decades-long legal battle, with Riefenstahl suing Gladitz repeatedly over specific factual claims in the film. Riefenstahl won several of these suits on narrow technical grounds, particularly regarding claims about direct personal selection of individual extras, victories she then publicized aggressively as vindication of her broader innocence, even though the core factual findings about the extras' imprisonment and subsequent deportation were never successfully overturned, and have since been confirmed by subsequent independent historical research. Gladitz, undeterred and financially strained by the litigation, continued pursuing the story for the remainder of her career, and her research would ultimately form the evidentiary backbone for the definitive scholarly accounts of the Tiefland scandal that emerged after Riefenstahl's death, when researchers finally had full access to archival material and were no longer facing the prospect of a personal lawsuit from Riefenstahl herself. As the war ground on toward its catastrophic end for Germany, Riefenstahl largely withdrew from active propaganda work, retreating to a chalet in the Bavarian Alps near Kitzbühel with her partner Peter Jacob, a Wehrmacht major and decorated mountain infantry officer she had married in March 1944, in a ceremony that, tellingly, still included congratulatory messages from Hitler's inner circle, despite the regime's mounting military catastrophes on every front. The marriage, contracted at a moment when Germany's defeat was already becoming apparent to anyone paying close attention to the war's trajectory, would not last, ending in divorce in 1946, amid the strain of Riefenstahl's post-war legal troubles and Jacob's own difficulty adjusting to defeat and captivity. But during the final chaotic months of the war, it provided Riefenstahl with a measure of stability as the Third Reich collapsed around her. She was not present for the fall of Berlin, was not among the inner circle who died or fled the bunker in the war's final days, and by the time American forces reached her Alpine retreat in May 1945, she was, in a sense, exactly where she had spent much of her career. At a comfortable remove from the worst of the violence, close enough to have benefited from proximity to power, distant enough to later claim she had never truly understood what that power was doing. American troops arrested Riefenstahl on May 30, 1945, taking her into custody for questioning about her relationship with the Nazi regime and her role in producing its most effective propaganda. What followed would be the beginning of a legal and reputational battle that would occupy the next several years of her life, and that would ultimately, despite everything the post-war investigations uncovered, end not in punishment, but in a series of increasingly lenient classifications that allowed her to eventually resume something resembling a normal life. How did a woman with this record, personal friendship with Hitler, direct participation in producing the regime's most effective propaganda films, eyewitness presence at a massacre of civilians, and the exploitation of concentration camp prisoners as unpaid film extras, end up facing no criminal prosecution whatsoever? The answer lies in the peculiar and often haphazard machinery of Allied denazification, a process that Riefenstahl would navigate with the same relentless determination and tactical skill she had once brought to securing Hitler's patronage. And it is to that process and its remarkable outcome that we turn next. The Allied denazification process that Riefenstahl now found herself subject to was, in the immediate post-war years, an evolving and often inconsistent system, divided across the 4 occupation zones and staffed by officials with wildly varying levels of resources, expertise, and appetite for pursuing complicated cases against cultural figures whose crimes, unlike those of camp commandants or army generals, did not fit neatly into existing legal categories. Riefenstahl would ultimately be investigated and classified not once, but across a series of 4 separate tribunals over the following years, an unusually protracted process that reflected both the genuine difficulty of her case and her own aggressive, well-resourced efforts to fight every unfavorable ruling. Her first period of detention came in the American zone, where she was held and interrogated periodically between 1945 and 1948, though never formally charged with a war crime. American investigators questioned her extensively about her relationship with Hitler, her role in producing Triumph of the Will and Olympia, and her presence at Konski, but ultimately concluded that while she had clearly been a Nazi collaborator and propagandist of considerable significance, there was insufficient evidence to charge her with a war crime under the legal frameworks being used at Nuremberg and in related proceedings, which focused primarily on direct participation in atrocities, mass murder, and the administrative machinery of the Holocaust, rather than on the production of propaganda films, however effective or morally compromised those films might have been. This distinction between propaganda as a moral and historical crime and propaganda as a prosecutable legal offence would prove to be the crack through which Riefenstahl ultimately slipped. She was subsequently transferred into French custody, since her Alpine residence fell within the French occupation zone, and it was the French denazification process that would prove the lengthiest and most consequential phase of her post-war reckoning. French authorities held her under varying degrees of restriction, including periods of house arrest and confinement in a psychiatric clinic between 1946 and 1948, and it was during this period that the most serious and sustained investigation into her wartime conduct took place, including detailed examination of the Tiefland extras and the Konski massacre. French investigators interviewed numerous witnesses, reviewed captured German documents, and by most accounts came closer than any other Allied investigative body to building a case that might have resulted in meaningful legal consequences. But the French process, like the American one before it, ultimately founded on the same basic legal problem. Propaganda filmmaking, however morally repugnant, did not clearly fall within the categories of crimes being prosecuted at Nuremberg and in related tribunals, which centered on crimes against peace, war crimes in the traditional sense of violations against combatants and prisoners, and crimes against humanity involving direct participation in persecution and murder. Riefenstahl's attorneys, and she employed a series of skilled and expensive ones throughout this period, argued forcefully and largely successfully that she had been merely an artist, that her films, however celebratory of the regime, did not constitute direct participation in its crimes, and that her presence at Konski, whatever the disputed details, did not establish culpability for a massacre she had not ordered, carried out, or had the power to prevent. Riefenstahl's period of confinement in a psychiatric clinic during the French occupation deserves particular attention, since it has become one of the more contested episodes in accounts of her post-war treatment. French authorities, uncertain how to categorize a defendant who did not fit neatly into existing frameworks for either straightforward war criminals or ordinary civilians, held her for a period of psychiatric evaluation, a decision Riefenstahl herself would later characterize in her memoirs and in interviews as a form of persecution and humiliation designed to break her spirit and discredit her testimony. Contemporaneous records suggest a somewhat different picture, indicating that the evaluation was intended at least in part to assess her mental state following the trauma of Germany's collapse and her own sudden reversal of fortune, and that she was not held in significantly harsher conditions than other high-profile detainees whose cases occupied a similarly ambiguous legal status. Whatever the precise motivations behind it, the episode left Riefenstahl with a lasting grievance that she would reference repeatedly for the rest of her life, as evidence of the unjust and excessive treatment she had supposedly endured at the hands of the Allies, a grievance that sat, often jarringly, alongside her simultaneous insistence that the same legal processes had ultimately and correctly vindicated her of any serious wrongdoing. The final German denazification tribunals, convened under the post-war German judicial system rather than direct Allied administration, took place across 1948 and into the early 1950s, and it was these proceedings that would produce Riefenstahl's ultimate legal classification. German denazification courts operated on a graduated system, classifying individuals into categories ranging from major offenders, subject to significant penalties including imprisonment and property confiscation, down through lesser offenders, followers, and finally exonerated persons. Riefenstahl was ultimately classified after considerable legal wrangling and multiple rounds of appeal as a Nazi sympathizer, a category that fell well short of major offender status and that carried no criminal penalty whatsoever. This classification arrived at years after her initial arrest and following an exhausting process of hearings, appeals, and legal maneuvering that would have worn down a less determined defendant, effectively closed the book on any formal legal accountability for her wartime conduct. She had been officially found to have been sympathetic to Nazism, a finding that was, on its face, almost comically insufficient given the actual scope of her involvement with the regime, but a finding that nonetheless carried no punishment, no prison sentence, no confiscation of assets beyond some initial restrictions that were later lifted, and no lasting legal disability that would prevent her from resuming her career. To lay out the timeline with precision, Riefenstahl's American zone detention and questioning ran intermittently from mid-1945 through 1948. Her transfer into French jurisdiction and the associated period of house arrest, psychiatric evaluation, and further interrogation occupied roughly 1946 through 1948. And the final German civil tribunals that produced her ultimate classification stretched from 1948 through a concluding appeal decided in 1952, meaning that Riefenstahl spent very nearly 7 full years, more than a fifth of the entire remaining span of her life, formally entangled in one stage or another of denazification proceedings before the matter was considered legally closed. Few other figures associated with Nazi cultural production faced a process quite this protracted, a fact that reflects reflects both the genuine difficulty regulators had in categorizing her conduct and her own unrelenting willingness to contest every unfavorable finding through further appeal rather than accept an early, harsher classification and move on. How did this happen? How did a woman with this documented history escape with a classification amounting, in practical terms, to a slap on the wrist? Several factors converged to produce this outcome. First, the sheer legal novelty of prosecuting propaganda as a war crime meant that Allied and German authorities alike were operating without clear precedent and were understandably more focused on prosecuting the architects of the Holocaust and the military leadership responsible for the war itself than on pursuing filmmakers, however influential their work had been. Second, Riefenstahl fought every ruling with extraordinary tenacity, hiring skilled attorneys, filing appeals, and outlasting investigators and prosecutors who often had limited resources and competing priorities as the initial post-war push for accountability gave way by the late 1940s to the practical concerns of rebuilding West Germany and the emerging tensions of the Cold War, which increasingly diverted Allied attention away from denazification and toward the strategic priorities of the developing confrontation with the Soviet Union. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Riefenstahl was aided by the fact that key witnesses and documentary evidence that might have more directly implicated her, particularly regarding her precise knowledge of and involvement in the treatment of the Tiefland extras, were incomplete, scattered, or simply not yet available to investigators in the years when her case was being actively adjudicated. It would take decades, well into the 1980s and beyond, for researchers to fully piece together the fate of the Roma and Sinti prisoners who had worked on her film, by which time the window for any criminal prosecution had long since closed under German statutes of limitations. Throughout this extended period of detention and investigation, Riefenstahl's interrogators repeatedly confronted her with testimony from former colleagues and Nazi officials who painted a considerably less flattering picture of her wartime conduct than the one she herself offered. Former camera operators who had worked on Triumph of the Will and Olympia, when questioned separately by Allied investigators, described a director who had been deeply and enthusiastically engaged with the political content of her work, who had personally lobbied party officials for additional resources, and who had expressed genuine admiration for Hitler and the broader aims of National Socialism in private conversation, not merely professional deference to a powerful patron. This testimony, scattered across interrogation records held by American, French, and eventually West German authorities, would form an important part of the historical record, even though it never translated into formal criminal charges, precisely because, as noted, the legal categories being used to prosecute Nazi crimes in the late 1940s were simply not designed to capture this kind of evidence about propaganda production and personal ideological sympathy in the absence of direct participation in violence. Riefenstahl's own strategy throughout these years of interrogation was remarkably consistent and, in retrospect, remarkably effective. She systematically minimized her personal relationship with Hitler, describing their many meetings as purely professional and infrequent, when documentary evidence, including her own pre-war correspondence and diary entries, suggested a far closer and more frequent association. She portrayed Triumph of the Will and Olympia as commissions she had felt unable to refuse, given the political realities of the time, rather than projects she had actively pursued and taken tremendous pride in at the time of their release, and she consistently professed total ignorance of the regime's persecution of Jews and other targeted groups until well after the war's end, a claim that grew increasingly difficult to sustain as investigators gathered more evidence, but that she nonetheless maintained without any meaningful variation for the rest of her life. This consistency, whether born of genuine self-delusion or calculated strategy, proved to be one of her most effective tools, since interrogators and later journalists alike found it extraordinarily difficult to shake testimony that never changed, no matter how many times it was challenged or how much contradictory evidence was placed in front of her. The result was a woman who had been Hitler's personal favorite, who had produced the regime's most celebrated propaganda, who had witnessed a massacre of civilians and said nothing publicly for years, and who had exploited concentration camp prisoners as unpaid film extras, walking away from the entire denazification process with nothing more than a bureaucratic label and a diminished but far from destroyed capacity to work. She would spend the rest of her long life defending this outcome as simple justice, insisting that the tribunals had correctly found her innocent of any real wrongdoing. a characterization that considerably overstated what a classification of Nazi sympathizer actually represented, but one she repeated with such consistency and such conviction in interview after interview across 5 subsequent decades that many casual observers came to accept it at face value. But if the courts had let her go, German public opinion, the film industry, and increasingly investigative journalists and historians were not nearly so willing to forget, and the fight over Leni Riefenstahl's legacy, rather than ending with her tribunal classification, was really only just beginning. Released from formal legal jeopardy but far from rehabilitated in the eyes of the public, Riefenstahl spent the 1950s attempting, with very limited success, to resume a filmmaking career that had once made her one of the most powerful women in Europe. Tiefland finally premiered in February 1954, nearly a decade after filming had wrapped to a muted and largely unenthusiastic reception. Its troubled production history and the unresolved questions about its Roma and Sinti extras casting a shadow over what might, in different circumstances, have been remembered as a technically accomplished piece of filmmaking. It would prove to be her final, completed feature film. Every subsequent attempt to launch a new project, and there were several throughout the following decade, collapsed under the weight of her reputation, with financiers, distributors, and collaborators repeatedly withdrawing once the press identified Riefenstahl's involvement and reminded the public of exactly who she was and what she had done during the Third Reich. A 1956 attempt to make a film in East Africa about the black slave trade, sometimes referred to as the Black Cargo Project, collapsed amid production disasters, including a serious car accident that hospitalized Riefenstahl for months and mounting international press scrutiny of her wartime past that made financing increasingly difficult to secure. Time and again throughout this period, Riefenstahl would begin promising new ventures only to watch them dissolve once journalists, particularly in West Germany, France and Britain, began asking pointed questions about Konski, about Tiefland's extras, and about her personal relationship with Hitler. Rather than retreating from public life, however, Riefenstahl adopted a strategy that would define the remainder of her career: aggressive legal combativeness against anyone who published claims about her wartime conduct that she considered inaccurate, exaggerated, or defamatory. It is worth emphasizing just how unusual this combativeness was among former Nazi cultural figures navigating the post-war decades. Many of her contemporaries, having escaped serious legal punishment through denazification classifications not unlike her own, generally preferred to fade quietly from public attention, giving occasional interviews but largely avoiding the kind of sustained, repeated legal confrontation with journalists and historians that Riefenstahl embraced almost as a full-time occupation for the better part of 5 decades. This relentlessness set her apart, and it is arguably the single factor most responsible for keeping her and the underlying questions about her wartime conduct continuously in public view for the remainder of the 20th century, when a quieter figure might simply have been forgotten. She filed an extraordinary number of lawsuits over the following decades against journalists, historians, and publications across West Germany and internationally, and she won a significant number of them, not necessarily because the underlying allegations were false, but because West German libel law placed a heavy burden of proof on defendants, and because Riefenstahl proved a remarkably persistent and well-funded litigant, willing to pursue cases for years when opponents with fewer resources often could not. These legal victories allowed her to construct and maintain for decades a public narrative in which she had been unfairly persecuted, misunderstood, and slandered by a press more interested in scandal than in truth, even as the underlying historical record, painstakingly assembled by researchers who were not deterred by her lawsuits, continued to paint an increasingly damning picture of her actual wartime conduct. This pattern, using litigation as a shield against historical accountability rather than as a genuine pursuit of truth, would follow Riefenstahl for the rest of her extraordinarily long life, and it raises one of the more uncomfortable questions at the heart of her story. To what extent did the legal system, both the denazification tribunals of the 1940s and the libel courts of subsequent decades, actually establish the truth of what she had done, versus simply establishing what could be proven to a particular legal standard within a particular window of time, using evidence that was often incomplete, and witnesses who were often unwilling or unable to testify against a wealthy, litigious, and increasingly internationally sympathetic figure? It is a question without a fully satisfying answer, but it is one that becomes increasingly urgent as we move into the next phase of Riefenstahl's life, a phase in which she would reinvent herself entirely, trading the mountains and the Nuremberg rally grounds for the deserts of Sudan, and in doing so would find a new audience, willing to celebrate her talent while largely, though never entirely, setting aside the question of what that talent had once been used to build. In 1962, at an age when most people are contemplating retirement, 60-year-old Leni Riefenstahl traveled to Sudan and encountered the Nuba people of the Nuba Mountains, an experience that would launch an entirely new chapter of her career and provide her with the closest thing to genuine international rehabilitation she would ever achieve. Over the following decades, she returned repeatedly to live among and photograph the Nuba, particularly the Mesakin and Cow communities, producing images of extraordinary technical skill, ritual wrestling matches, elaborate body painting, the physical grace and strength of Nuba men and women, captured with the same eye for idealized monumental human form that had characterized her Nazi-era films decades earlier. This was not, critics were quick to point out, an accidental continuity. The Nuba photographs, later published in celebrated volumes including The Last of the Nuba in 1973, employed strikingly similar aesthetic principles to Olympia and Triumph of the Will. Bodies photographed from low angles to emphasize their monumentality, an obsessive focus on physical perfection and strength, images that celebrated what could easily be read as a continuation of the same idealized, almost eugenic vision of human physicality that had once served Nazi racial ideology. The American writer and critic Susan Sontag would produce the single most influential and devastating critical analysis of this continuity in her landmark 1975 essay, Fascinating Fascism, published in the New York Review of Books, arguing that Riefenstahl's Nuba photography represented not a break from her fascist aesthetic sensibilities, but their direct continuation in a new, superficially apolitical context, replacing marching Nazi soldiers with idealized African tribespeople while retaining the exact same visual grammar of hierarchy, physical perfection, and submission to a higher aesthetic and, implicitly, ideological order. Sontag's essay landed with tremendous force in intellectual circles and did lasting damage to Riefenstahl's efforts to present the Nuba work as evidence of her fundamental innocence, her supposed lifelong devotion to beauty rather than politics. Riefenstahl predictably rejected Sontag's analysis entirely and continued to insist, as she had for decades already, that her interest in the Nuba was purely humanistic and anthropological, entirely divorced from any lingering ideological sympathies. Whatever the merits of that defense, and most serious critics found it deeply unpersuasive, the Nuba photographs did succeed, at least commercially and among segments of the international art world, in rebuilding Riefenstahl's reputation as a serious visual artist, generating book sales, magazine spreads in publications including the Sunday Times magazine, and eventually Playboy in 1969 and 1972, and a level of renewed respectability that would have seemed unimaginable during the depths of her post-war isolation in the late 1940s and 1950s. Riefenstahl's 1972 appearance in Playboy magazine, featuring a selection of her Nuba photography alongside a lengthy profile, generated its own distinct wave of controversy, drawing criticism both from those objecting to the normalization of a former Nazi propagandist within mainstream American popular culture, and from feminist critics who viewed the pairing of Riefenstahl's idealized, physically fetishized imagery of African bodies with a magazine built around the sexualized display of women's bodies as a particularly uncomfortable convergence of two different overlapping forms of objectification. Riefenstahl herself, characteristically, expressed no discomfort with the placement, viewing it simply as another prestigious international publishing platform willing to showcase her photographic work to a broad audience, a framing that, once again, revealed her persistent tendency to evaluate opportunities in terms of visibility and prestige, while remaining strikingly unreflective about the broader political and ethical implications of how and where her work appeared. Riefenstahl's time in Sudan was cut short in the early 1970s, amid growing political instability and her own advancing age. But rather than settling into a quiet retirement, she embarked on yet another reinvention, one that would occupy the final 3 decades of her life and provide perhaps the most bizarre coda imaginable to a career that had begun with mountain films and Nazi rallies. In 1974, at the age of 72, having lied about her age on a certification form to obtain her diving credentials, since the legal age limit at the time was younger than her actual years, Riefenstahl learned to scuba dive. She would go on to become, by a considerable margin, one of the oldest active scuba divers in the world, spending the following decades diving in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and numerous other locations, photographing coral reefs and marine life with the same technical exactitude and compositional ambition she had once brought to alpine peaks and Olympic athletes. This underwater photography would eventually be compiled into a documentary film, Impressionen unter Wasser, or Underwater Impressions, released in 2002, when Riefenstahl was 100 years old, making her, by most accounts, the oldest active filmmaker in the world at the time of its release. It is difficult to overstate how strange this final act of her career appears against the backdrop of everything that preceded it. A woman who had once orchestrated the visual mythology of the Third Reich for Adolf Hitler personally, spending her final decades gliding through coral reefs with an underwater camera rig, presenting herself with apparent sincerity as a nature lover and environmental documentarian. Throughout these decades of reinvention, Riefenstahl never stopped defending her wartime record, and if anything, her public combativeness on the subject seemed to intensify rather than soften with age. She gave numerous interviews across the 1980s, 1990s, and into the early 2000s in which she reiterated, with remarkable consistency of language and framing, the same core claims she had first advanced during the denazification tribunals of the late 1940s. That she had never been a member of the Nazi Party, a technically true but deeply misleading claim given her extraordinarily close personal and professional relationship with Hitler and her voluntary, enthusiastic production of the regime's central propaganda works. That she had known nothing of the Holocaust or the broader machinery of persecution until after the war ended, a claim historians have found essentially impossible to credit given her documented presence at Konski and her direct use of concentration camp prisoners as film extras, and that Triumph of the Will in Olympia had been works of pure documentary observation rather than deliberately constructed propaganda, a claim that collapses almost immediately upon any serious examination of how those films were financed, planned, and produced in close coordination with the highest levels of the Nazi state. The most significant and legally consequential reckoning with these claims came late in Riefenstahl's life, when a German journalist and documentary filmmaker tracked down surviving Roma Holocaust survivors and their descendants who had worked, or whose relatives had worked, as extras on Tiefland, and definitively established that a number of them had subsequently been deported to Auschwitz and murdered, directly contradicting Riefenstahl's repeated public claims that she had personally verified all of the extras survived the war unharmed. One survivor in particular, whose story became central to this reckoning, successfully sued Riefenstahl over her continued public assertions, forcing a rare and grudging partial retraction, Riefenstahl acknowledging in the early 2000s, in the final years of her life and only after losing the legal battle, that she could not in fact substantiate her long-repeated claim that all the Tiefland extras had survived. It was as close to an admission of wrongdoing as Riefenstahl would ever offer, wrung from her not by conscience but by the accumulated weight of documentary evidence and courtroom testimony that had simply become impossible to continue denying. A remarkable feature-length documentary released in 1993, The Wonderful, Horrible Life of Leni Riefenstahl, directed by Ray Muller with Riefenstahl's own extensive cooperation, captured this dynamic in vivid detail, following the 90-year-old filmmaker as she alternated between moments of genuine reflection and, far more frequently, fierce, almost combative defensiveness whenever confronted with uncomfortable questions about her past. The film became, for many viewers around the world, their first substantial introduction to Riefenstahl's full biography, and its title captured something essential about the woman it profiled. A genuinely wonderful visual artist whose life, viewed honestly, was also genuinely horrible in its moral dimensions. Two facts that Riefenstahl herself, even at the very end of her life, never managed, or perhaps never wished to reconcile. Certain moments from Muller's documentary have since become iconic in their own right among students of Riefenstahl's life, particularly a sequence in which Muller presses her directly on the Konski massacre and the fate of the Tiefland extras, and the camera captures Riefenstahl's visible irritation escalating rapidly into outright anger, at one point halting the interview altogether and demanding the cameras be turned off, only to resume moments later with the same practiced denials she had offered for decades. Other sequences show a considerably more disarming Riefenstahl, discussing her early dance training or her technical approach to editing with genuine, infectious enthusiasm, reminding viewers of exactly why her talent had once captivated audiences and patrons alike, before the conversation would inevitably circle back to the darker chapters of her biography, and her guard would snap back into place. Miller himself later described the experience of making the film as an object lesson in the limits of documentary persuasion, noting that no quantity of documentary evidence presented to Riefenstahl across the production seemed capable of shifting her fundamental narrative about her own innocence. A narrative that had, by the 1990s, been rehearsed and refined across so many decades of interviews and legal proceedings that it had become, for her, something closer to settled personal truth than a position she was still actively defending against contrary evidence. The Nuba communities Riefenstahl photographed were themselves living through a period of profound disruption, caught between traditional ways of life and the encroaching pressures of Sudanese state authority, missionary activity, and the early stirrings of the civil conflicts that would eventually devastate the region for decades. Riefenstahl, characteristically, showed little interest in this broader political context, focusing her camera instead on ceremonial wrestling matches between Mesakeen men, their bodies elaborately decorated with ash and pigment, on courtship rituals, and on the physical bearing of individuals she selected specifically for their conformity to her own aesthetic standards of strength and beauty. She lived among the Nuba for extended periods, across multiple expeditions throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, learning enough of the local language to communicate directly and, by most accounts, formed genuine personal relationships with individuals in the communities she photographed. Relationships that her defenders would later cite as evidence of authentic engagement rather than exploitative tourism. Her critics countered that authentic personal relationships with individual subjects did not erase the broader pattern of the work, an aging European woman selecting and photographing African bodies, according to a visual grammar she had first developed decades earlier while working for a regime built on racial hierarchy and profiting handsomely from books and magazine spreads sold primarily to Western audiences. It is worth situating Riefenstahl's post-war trajectory alongside those of other prominent cultural figures who had served the Nazi regime, because the comparison illuminates just how unusual, and in some ways how successful, her particular strategy of survival and reinvention actually was. Arno Brieker, Hitler's favoured sculptor, whose monumental, muscular statuary had adorned Nazi architecture throughout Berlin, faced his own denazification proceedings after the war and was likewise classified in a relatively lenient category. But he never achieved anything approaching Riefenstahl's later international rehabilitation, spending his remaining decades working in relative obscurity, still sculpting, still defending his wartime choices, but never again capturing significant mainstream attention or critical reconsideration. The conductor, Wilhelm Furtwängler, who had remained in Germany throughout the Nazi period and led performances closely associated with the regime's cultural prestige, underwent a formal denazification tribunal in 1946 that, unlike Riefenstahl's drawn-out and multi-jurisdictional ordeal, concluded relatively quickly with his exoneration, and he was able to resume his conducting career internationally within a few years, aided by prominent defenders, including the violinist Yehudi Menuhin, who argued that Furtwängler's choice to remain and use his position to quietly protect some Jewish musicians outweighed his symbolic value to the regime. Riefenstahl's case differed from both of these in a crucial respect. Unlike Brieker, she achieved genuine international rehabilitation and continued creative relevance decades after the war, and unlike Furtwängler, she achieved this despite evidence of far more direct and personal complicity in violence against civilians, evidence that her own considerable legal and public relations skill, rather than the intervention of prominent defenders, ultimately allowed her to outlast and outmaneuver. The scholarly reckoning with Riefenstahl's life has itself been a story of competing and often bitterly opposed interpretations. The American historian Stephen Bach, whose 2007 biography, Leni, The Life and Work of Leni Riefenstahl, remains one of the most rigorously documented English-language accounts, presented a portrait built methodically from archival evidence, financial records, and contemporaneous correspondence that left little room for Riefenstahl's central claims of apolitical innocence, systematically dismantling, footnote by footnote, the narrative she had spent 60 years constructing. The German scholar Jürgen Traimborn's own biography, published shortly before Bach's and translated into English in 2007 as well, reached broadly similar conclusions through independent research, describing Riefenstahl as a supremely gifted opportunist whose relationship with the truth about her own past was, at absolute best, catastrophically self-serving. Both biographies drew heated responses from Riefenstahl's remaining defenders and from Kettner, who continued managing her estate and legacy after her death, but neither biography has been successfully challenged on its core factual findings, and together they represent the closest thing to a settled historical consensus that Riefenstahl's case now enjoys, arriving, tellingly, only after she herself was no longer alive to sue their authors into silence or submission. Riefenstahl's post-war trajectory also invites comparison with another woman who occupied a position of considerable cultural influence within the Nazi orbit. Winifred Wagner, the English-born widow of Siegfried Wagner and daughter-in-law of the composer Richard Wagner, who ran the Bayreuth Festival throughout the Nazi period and maintained an extraordinarily close personal friendship with Hitler, addressing him with the informal du and hosting him repeatedly at Bayreuth in the years before the war. Like Riefenstahl, Winifred Wagner underwent denazification proceedings after the war, was classified in a relatively lenient category. Despite her documented closeness to Hitler and lived out her remaining decades, she died in 1980, largely unrepentant, giving interviews late in life in which she stated flatly that she would still welcome Hitler through her door were he somehow to reappear, a level of open, unapologetic nostalgia for the regime that even Riefenstahl, whatever the deficiencies of her own post-war honesty, generally avoided expressing so baldly in public. The parallel between the two women, both occupying rarefied positions of cultural influence adjacent to Hitler personally, both escaping serious legal consequence, both spending their remaining decades managing carefully constructed public narratives about their proximity to Nazism, illustrates a broader pattern in how women who wielded soft cultural power under the Third Reich were assessed and largely spared by a post-war legal system built primarily around the paradigm of men who had commanded armies, run camps, or administered the machinery of deportation and murder. Among the dozens of legal actions Riefenstahl pursued across her post-war decades, a handful stand out as particularly illustrative of her broader strategy. In the 1970s and again in the 1980s, she brought successful suits against German publications that had described her using terms like Hitler's filmmaker or Nazi propagandist without, in the court's judgment, sufficient qualification or nuance, forcing corrections and retractions that she then cited publicly as proof that such characterizations were legally unfounded, even though the underlying facts about her role in producing Triumph of the Will and Olympia were never seriously in dispute. She sued a French magazine over claims regarding her wartime activities and a British newspaper over similar characterizations, and in nearly every instance her legal teams focused not on disproving the core historical facts, which were by this point extremely well documented, but on challenging specific wording, implications, or the precise legal distinction between being a propagandist by function versus a propagandist by party membership or formal state office. It was a subtle but remarkably effective strategy. By winning narrow, technical victories over specific phrasings, she was able to create a cumulative public impression of vindication that vastly outstripped what the actual rulings had established. German public opinion regarding Riefenstahl shifted considerably across the decades following the war, tracking broader changes in how West Germany, and later reunified Germany, chose to grapple with the Nazi past more generally. In the immediate post-war years and through the 1950s, amid a broader national reluctance to dwell too deeply on collective complicity in Nazi crimes, Riefenstahl's rehabilitation proceeded relatively quietly, with many Germans either unaware of or uninterested in relitigating the wartime conduct of a filmmaker whose most famous works had, after all, been officially banned from public exhibition since 1945. This changed markedly from the late 1960s onward, as a younger generation of Germans, born after the war and increasingly unwilling to accept their parents' generation's comparative silence about the Nazi period, began pressing far more insistent questions about figures like Riefenstahl, who had prospered under the regime and never faced meaningful accountability. Directors associated with the new German cinema movement of the 1960s and 1970s, including several who were openly critical of what they saw as West Germany's incomplete reckoning with its fascist past, occasionally invoked Riefenstahl by name as an emblem of exactly the kind of unaddressed continuity between the Nazi era and post-war German cultural life that their own filmmaking sought to confront. By the time of her death in 2003, German public opinion toward Riefenstahl had settled into something considerably more skeptical and critical than it had been 50 years earlier, even as she personally had never stopped enjoying the practical benefits, financial security, continued ability to publish and exhibit her work, freedom from any lasting legal restriction of the comparatively lenient treatment she had received in the 1940s. Riefenstahl's very last public appearances, given in the final year of her life to promote Underwater Impressions and to mark her 100th and then 101st birthdays, showed a woman who remained until literally her final months, sharp, articulate, and utterly undiminished in her capacity to discuss her work and defend her legacy with the same fluency she had displayed at every stage of the preceding 60 years. Interviewers who met her during this period, expecting perhaps a frail centenarian, softened by age into some measure of reflective candor, instead frequently described encountering someone whose command of her own narrative and whose determination to control how that narrative was received remained entirely intact. A final testament to just how thoroughly Riefenstahl had internalized and how skillfully she continued to perform the role of the misunderstood artist she had first begun constructing in the interrogation rooms of 1945. In 2002, the same year Underwater Impressions was released, Riefenstahl faced renewed public scrutiny and a criminal complaint in Germany after making public comments during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, suggesting she had witnessed no atrocities during a visit to a Sudanese refugee camp. Comments that a human rights organization argued constituted a form of Holocaust-adjacent denial regarding her broader historical claims about not witnessing wartime violence, though the specific legal complaint centered on separate incidents. The complaint ultimately did not result in prosecution, one final instance among so many across her 98 years following the war's end of Riefenstahl facing scrutiny for her conduct and her claims without ever facing meaningful legal consequence. She had, by this point, spent nearly 6 decades perfecting the art of surviving accusation, and she would carry that skill with her, essentially, to the grave. It is worth pausing to consider the practical realities that allowed Riefenstahl to sustain this decades-long campaign of self-justification, because it was not simply a matter of stubbornness or personality. She benefited enormously from a support network that persisted across her entire post-war life, most notably her relationship with Horst Kettner, a cameraman more than 40 years her junior who became her partner in the early 1970s during the Nuber years and remained with her as companion, business manager, and eventual sole heir until her death in 2003. Kettner managed much of the practical apparatus of Riefenstahl's later career, from organizing her diving expeditions to negotiating publishing contracts for her photography books, to helping coordinate her legal strategy against journalists and historians whose work she found objectionable. Their relationship, though never formalized through marriage, provided Riefenstahl with a stability and continuity of support that few other former Nazi propagandists of her generation enjoyed in their later years, and it is difficult to separate her remarkable longevity as a public figure, remaining active, litigious, and internationally visible well into her 90s, from the practical infrastructure Kettner helped provide. Riefenstahl's 1987 autobiography, published in German and later translated into English, became another crucial pillar of her carefully maintained public narrative, a lengthy and meticulously constructed account of her life that reasserted at great length and with considerable literary skill every element of the defense she had been refining since the late 1940s. The book was a commercial success and received a mixed critical reception, with some reviewers praising its vivid depiction of the German film industry during the Weimar and Nazi periods, while others, particularly historians who had spent years researching the documentary record independently, criticized it as a masterwork of selective memory and strategic omission. Notable as much for what it left out, detailed acknowledgement of the Tiefland extra's fate, any serious reckoning with Konski, any admission of genuine ideological sympathy with National Socialism, as for what it included. The autobiography nonetheless succeeded in shaping how a significant portion of the reading public, particularly those encountering Riefenstahl's story for the first time decades after the war, came to understand her life, reinforcing the narrative of the apolitical artist swept up by forces beyond her control that she had spent her entire post-war existence constructing. Awards and honours continued to find their way to Riefenstahl, even as controversy dogged nearly every public appearance she made. She received recognition from photography and film institutions in various countries for her technical achievements and her Nuba and underwater photography, invitations to film festivals that sparked protests and boycotts in roughly equal measure to the celebrations that accompanied them, and a level of grudging critical respect for her purely technical filmmaking abilities that persisted among cinematographers and film scholars regardless of, or in an uncomfortable tension with, her political history. This tension between recognition of her genuine artistic talent and revulsion at the uses to which she had put it followed Riefenstahl to essentially every public appearance she made for the remainder of her life, and it remains, even now, more than 2 decades after her death, one of the most difficult and contested aspects of how film history chooses to remember her. Leni Riefenstahl died on September 8th, 2003 at her home in Puking, Bavaria, just 2 weeks after celebrating her 101st birthday. The cause was reported as cancer, and she died, by all accounts, peacefully, surrounded by the wealth, the recognition, and the carefully maintained public narrative she had spent nearly 6 decades constructing and defending. Horst Kettner, her partner of more than 30 years, was at her side. She was cremated and her ashes interred in Munich, and her death prompted a wave of obituaries around the world that, almost without exception, grappled with the same fundamental tension that had defined every serious assessment of her life: how to reconcile genuine, undeniable, artistic and technical brilliance with a record of willing service to one of history's most murderous regimes and a post-war record of evasion, litigation and denial that stretched, essentially unbroken, from 1945 to within months of her death. The New York Times obituary described her with careful and deliberate precision as a supremely gifted filmmaker whose talent had been placed permanently and irrevocably in the service of Nazi propaganda, language that captured the essential paradox nearly every serious historian and critic has wrestled with in assessing her legacy. The Guardian's obituary was considerably less generous, emphasizing her decades of denial and her exploitation of Roma and Sinti prisoners on the set of Tiefland as the defining, unforgivable facts of her biography, facts that no subsequent Nuba photography or underwater documentary could meaningfully counterbalance. German press coverage was similarly divided, reflecting a national conversation about Riefenstahl and more broadly about how post-war Germany had handled the question of cultural and artistic complicity in Nazism that had never fully been resolved during her lifetime and that her death did nothing to settle. What, in the end, should we make of Leni Riefenstahl? It is worth returning in these final sections to the central question this video opened with: how did a woman with this record escape any meaningful legal punishment? The most honest answer is that the post-war legal frameworks constructed to punish Nazi crimes, the Nuremberg trials, and the various denazification tribunals that followed were built primarily to address direct participation in mass murder, the administrative machinery of the Holocaust, and traditional war crimes involving violence against combatants and prisoners. They were not well equipped to address the harder question of cultural and artistic complicity, the question of what responsibility attaches to someone who did not personally pull a trigger or sign a deportation order, but who instead built the beautiful, seductive imagery that made a genocidal regime appear glorious, inevitable, and worthy of popular devotion to tens of millions of ordinary people. Riefenstahl fell, quite deliberately, and through her own considerable legal skill, into the gap between these two categories of accountability, and once the initial post-war push for justice gave way to Cold War priorities and the practical business of rebuilding West Germany, that gap proved wide enough for her to walk through entirely unpunished. This does not mean history has been kind to her. Quite the opposite. While German courts classified her at most as a Nazi sympathizer, the verdict of historians, critics, and the broader public conversation about her life has been considerably harsher and, in the view of most serious scholars, considerably more accurate. Triumph of the Will is taught in film schools not merely as a technical achievement, but as a case study in how cinematic language itself can be weaponized in service of totalitarianism. and it is almost always taught alongside careful examination of Riefenstahl's own post-war deceptions, ensuring that students encounter both the craft and the moral catastrophe simultaneously, rather than one without the other. Susan Sontag's essay on fascist aesthetics remains a standard text in serious discussions of Riefenstahl's entire body of work, including her later superficially apolitical photography and the survivor testimony and documentary research establishing the fate of the Tiefland extras, has become an essential permanent part of any honest account of her career, no matter how many lawsuits she filed or how many decades she spent denying it. There is also a broader lesson embedded in Riefenstahl's story, one that extends well beyond the specific facts of her own biography, about the seductive danger of separating artistic genius from moral accountability, about how easily technical brilliance can be mistaken for, or deliberately used to manufacture, an appearance of innocence. Riefenstahl spent nearly 60 years insisting that she had simply been an artist pursuing beauty, that politics had never truly interested her, and that history had unfairly conflated her aesthetic choices with the crimes of the regime that funded and celebrated them. It is a defense that has been offered in various forms by numerous other cultural figures who worked under authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century, and Riefenstahl's case remains one of the most thoroughly documented and most instructive examples of why that defense, however sincerely believed by the person offering it, does not withstand serious historical scrutiny. An artist who seeks out the patronage of a genocidal regime, who builds that regime's central propaganda, works with genuine enthusiasm and considerable skill, who witnesses violence against civilians and says nothing, and who exploits imprisoned, persecuted people as unpaid labor on a film set, has made choices, not simply been swept along by forces beyond her control, regardless of how elegantly she photographs a diving competition or a coral reef decades later. Perhaps the fairest and most durable summary of Riefenstahl's legacy is this: she was never held legally accountable for what she did, but she was never able to fully outrun it either. For nearly 6 decades after the war ended, wherever she went, whatever new artistic reinvention she attempted, the questions followed her, the journalists followed her, the lawsuits piled up, and the historical records, slowly but steadily assembled by researchers who refused to be intimidated by her considerable legal resources, grew more damning rather than less with each passing decade. She died wealthy, internationally recognized for her technical achievements, and legally unpunished. But she also died having spent almost the entirety of her adult life after 1945 fighting, litigating, and denying her way through a reckoning that the courts never fully delivered, but that history in the end largely did. Whether that constitutes justice is a question this video will leave for you to decide, but it is difficult to look at the full arc of her life, from the mountaintops of Bavaria to the Nuremberg rally grounds to the coral reefs of the Indian Ocean, and conclude that she ever truly escaped what she had built with Adolf Hitler in those extraordinary, terrible years of the 1930s. There is one further dimension of Riefenstahl's story worth considering, because it helps explain some of the peculiar contours of both her rise and her post-war survival. The fact that she operated throughout her entire career as one of the only women to wield significant creative authority at the highest levels of the Nazi cultural apparatus. The regime's leadership was overwhelmingly, almost exclusively male, and Riefenstahl's position as Hitler's favoured filmmaker was, in some respects, genuinely exceptional within that context, a fact she herself sometimes invoked, particularly in later interviews, as evidence that she could not have been a true ideological believer, since National Socialism's own rhetoric relegated women primarily to domestic and reproductive roles rather than positions of public creative authority. Historians have generally found this argument unpersuasive as an excuse for her conduct, noting that Hitler's personal patronage often operated according to his own individual tastes and priorities rather than strict ideological consistency, and that Riefenstahl's gender, far from constraining her, appears to have granted her a kind of protected, almost singular status that shielded her from some of the internal party rivalries and scrutiny that a male filmmaker in an equivalent position might have faced from competitors within the regime's cultural bureaucracy. At the same time, her gender likely also shaped how post-war investigators and the wider public assessed her culpability, with some historians arguing that Riefenstahl benefited, whether consciously or not, from a broader post-war tendency to view women's involvement in the machinery of the Third Reich as fundamentally more peripheral, more passive, and less deserving of the same scrutiny applied to the men who dominated the regime's military and administrative structures, an assumption the specific facts of Riefenstahl's own case, personal patronage from Hitler himself, direct production of the regime's central propaganda, eyewitness presence at civilian massacre, exploitation of concentration camp prisoners, thoroughly and repeatedly contradicts. The contrast with Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Reich Minister of Armaments, is perhaps the single most instructive comparison available when considering how differently Nazi-era accountability could unfold, depending on the specific legal categories a person's conduct happened to fall into. Speer stood trial at Nuremberg, itself was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role directing forced and slave labor within the German armaments industry, and served 20 full years in Spandau prison, emerging in 1966 to spend the remainder of his life as a prolific author whose memoirs, while themselves later shown to contain significant, self-serving distortions and omissions regarding how much he actually knew about the Holocaust, at least represented an acknowledgement that punishment had been deserved and served. Riefenstahl, whose personal closeness to Hitler arguably rivaled or exceeded Speer's, and whose propaganda work provided the regime with cultural legitimacy that Speer's buildings and armaments never could, faced no equivalent tribunal, no equivalent conviction, and no equivalent sentence, not because her moral culpability was obviously less severe, but because propaganda and image-making simply did not fit within the legal architecture that Nuremberg had been built to address. Speer went to prison. Riefenstahl went diving. It is one of the starkest illustrations imaginable of how post-war justice, however well-intentioned, was ultimately shaped and limited by the specific legal categories available to prosecutors in 1945 and 1946, categories that could capture a man who signed off on forced labor allocations but could not capture a woman whose camera had done nearly as much to make the regime's violence palatable to millions of ordinary Germans. The influence of Riefenstahl's technique on subsequent filmmaking, entirely separate from any of the ideological content that technique originally served, is itself a matter of considerable and sometimes uncomfortable historical record. Film historians have long noted the visual debt that later, avowedly non-political epic filmmaking owes to the compositional strategies Riefenstahl pioneered in Triumph of the Will and Olympia. Low-angle shots that render human figures monumental, tracking cameras that turn mass movement into rhythmic spectacle, editing patterns that build emotional momentum toward a climactic, quasi-religious revelation of a central heroic figure. Sequences in later blockbuster filmmaking, including the medal ceremony that closes George Lucas's 1977 film Star Wars, have been repeatedly and specifically compared by critics to the visual grammar of Triumph of the Will, not necessarily because Lucas intended any ideological echo, but because Riefenstahl's techniques for filming mass ceremony and heroic ascent proved so effective that they entered the basic visual vocabulary of 20th century cinema, absorbed by filmmakers who may have had little or no awareness of or interest in their original propagandistic purpose. This afterlife of her technique, divorced from its original context and repurposed endlessly across decades of filmmaking with no connection whatsoever to Nazism, is perhaps the strangest and most unsettling part of Riefenstahl's legacy. The demonstration that the tools of manipulation she perfected are, in the end, ideologically neutral instruments, as available to a Hollywood blockbuster as they once were to a genocidal dictatorship. A fact that ought to trouble anyone who assumes that technical brilliance in image-making is somehow inherently benign. Film academics have devoted entire courses of study specifically to the editing rhythms Riefenstahl developed for Triumph of the Will and Olympia, examining how she synchronized visual cuts to musical scores composed specifically for the films, building what scholars of montage theory describe as an almost hypnotic entrainment effect, in which audiences' emotional responses become synchronized to the editing rhythm itself, largely independent of the specific visual content being shown. This technique, refined by Riefenstahl to an extraordinary degree of sophistication for her era, has since been studied and consciously replicated by filmmakers working in genres as varied as sports broadcasting, political campaign advertising, and corporate promotional video, contexts in which the explicit ideological content is entirely different from anything Riefenstahl intended, but in which the underlying mechanism, using rhythm and repetition to manufacture emotional conviction independent of rational argument, remains recognizably the same tool she pioneered on the Nuremberg rally grounds in 1934. Film festivals and retrospectives continue to grapple, often clumsily, with how to handle Riefenstahl's legacy for years after her death. Proposed tributes and retrospective screenings at various festivals across Europe and North America in the years following her passing routinely triggered public controversy, with Jewish organizations, Roma advocacy groups, and historians frequently objecting to any framing that celebrated her technical achievements without foregrounding, prominently and unavoidably, the full context of how those achievements had been produced and at what human cost. Some festivals proceeded with carefully contextualized screenings, pairing her films with critical commentary and historical background. Others cancelled planned tributes entirely rather than navigate the controversy. This pattern of institutions perpetually relitigating how much space to give a genuinely important but morally catastrophic body of work shows no real sign of resolving even now, more than 2 decades after Riefenstahl's death. And it mirrors, on a smaller scale, the exact same tension that defined every stage of her own post-war life: the impossibility of fully separating what she made from what she was. Her estate, substantial after decades of book royalties, photography sales, and licensing income from her film archive, passed almost entirely to Horst Kettner, who continued managing and, where he judged necessary, defending her legacy through the following years until his own death in 2016. Control of Riefenstahl's vast personal archive, including thousands of photographs, production documents, and personal correspondence spanning nearly the entire 20th century, subsequently became the subject of its own prolonged institutional negotiation, eventually finding a home in Germany's Federal Archives and the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, where researchers finally gained the kind of systematic, comprehensive access to primary source material that Riefenstahl herself had spent decades controlling, restricting, and litigating over during her own lifetime. It is a small but telling irony that some of the most damning archival confirmation of her wartime conduct, financial records, correspondence, production documents, became fully available to historians only after her death placed them beyond her power to sue. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the extraordinary and deeply troubling life of Leni Riefenstahl informative. If you enjoyed learning about the figures who shaped, served, and ultimately tried to outrun the legacy of the Third Reich, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we explore how the women closest to the regime's inner circle navigated their own post-war reckonings, as well as our video on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, which follows the next generation as they grappled with the crimes of their parents. And if Riefenstahl's escape from meaningful punishment left you curious about how other perpetrators managed to avoid justice altogether, don't miss our video on the rat lines that helped Nazi war criminals flee to Argentina and beyond. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one!